So
So
yeah.
we have an urgent meeting of several of my board members probably tomorrow night. They're responding to the doodle polls. But, we're in the process of launching these day after conversations. And I wrote my board chair yesterday. I said, boy, last few days have bring an additional meaning to the idea of day after.
Mhm.
And we need to address that because so the day after comes as a consequence of our work on achieving the promise of work and what we're trying to do with that. And one of our core principles is addressing structural inequalities, inequities, and racism and gender bias and so forth. And so we can't slide past the conversation, not that we want to, but it's not something that we can not address directly.
Right.
And so we're trying to sort out how do we do it responsibly and constructively. And so I asked for a group of my board members to work with me on how we do that. So
Yeah, those are some big things we're trying to tackle right now. So hi,
yeah, I
Scott.
mean,
It's good to see you.
so yes, it is. It's a challenge, and
Yeah.
so there's one board member in particular. I'm really trying to make sure she gets on the call. She's actually a poet, Detroit. Her name is Natasha Miller,
Hmm.
African American, queer, and a real exceptional person. So she actually performed her poetry at our conference on the many futures of work and just blew everybody away. And so we invited her on the board, but she's no offense to millennials, but she's a millennial, and sometimes it's a little hard to get on her radar.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So
Well, and she shares a name with her name is Natasha. My daughter's name is Natasha,
my
and
sister's name is Natasha.
they have similar personalities, and they're both tall. They're both about 5'10", and so there's just a lot of things about Natasha Miller, the board member, and Natasha Edwards, Criticos Edwards, my daughter, that seem to line up. And so, anyway.
Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing. I just shared the agenda. I had a little panic moment when I said, did we just not keep notes from last month, and realizing that this was the rescheduled call from last month. So so I know that the topic of discussion for today is, I want to be able to frame this correctly, is talking about initiatives and efforts around funding projects for sustainable work. And I know that with Norris and Christine having recently done the webinar that they'll be able to tell you a little bit more about. I think there's definitely opportunities out there. And normally we start this off with a check-in question. It's Monday morning, Monday at noon for some people. And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge a lot of the things, the tensions, the all of that stuff, and without taking a moment to really just kind of be visible and sit in the moment where we acknowledge that there's a lot of stuff going out there in the world between the pandemic and the all the protests and things like that. And so in lieu of a lighthearted check-in question, I'd love to just give space for a time for people to kind of very briefly just either give us a word or things that that you're feeling, sensing right now, to give an opportunity to do that. So I will just open it up and let whoever wants to speak, and do that. I was sharing with Peter that last night as I came home from a happy dinner and chatting with my son in New Zealand, my friend called me to check on me because I'm 3 blocks away from where the police were shooting tear gas into a crowd of protesters. So I didn't hear it. I was in my own little world, but a couple of blocks from me, there was chaos and mayhem, and thankfully nobody got hurt last night, but people have gotten hurt. Yesterday was the 99th anniversary of the largest race massacre in modern history, which took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So it's a lot of those things going on all at once. So I'm arriving a little heavy.
Well, I'll kick it off real quick. I know I was talking when others are coming on. So Thursday, I sent a note to my board chair, Ronnie Bryant, who headed the Charlotte Regional Partnership, and I was telling him that this is before all the disturbances hit Chicago. But this was reminding me of the 1968, so I'll show my age here, 68 protests that ended up with large swaths of Chicago's West Side being burned down. And this followed the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, and then other events that spring. And it was just, it was troubling that this was bringing back those memories. And then, of course, this weekend, Chicago's downtown got really ripped apart, and it it seems that a lot of the protest has gotten hijacked by looters, and it just undermines the purpose and messages that the people who were protesting legitimately were trying to bring. And I'm not saying that they weren't violent. I mean, some were, but I could tolerate that. What I can't tolerate is the looting, and so they shut downtown Chicago down yesterday. And so, just to make the point, commercial strips all across the southwest sides, Chicago. These are many of these areas are majority minority, African American in particular. Those stores got ransacked and looted there. People went after suburban malls; those got ripped apart. I was telling Celia that my house is literally a block outside of Chicago. And we bump up against neighborhood in Chicago that is noted for being somewhat high, being very high crime, and the police in our community just shut the major streets off. So it's really, to me, it's just really tragic how all this other trouble has just completely buried the importance of the moment, and the message that was initially coming out of Minnesota, but has been repeated and repeated and repeated for generations. Anyway, done.
So, what are we supposed to be doing again? I'm sorry.
I just wanted to offer space to share how you're feeling, or to address what's going on.
All right, so I'll go next. I could talk about this forever, but mixed emotions, right? But it's been, like we said, it's been going on forever. What's irritating is, but I have resolve, I'll say that. But what's irritating is the mix of messages, right? So I've been in a couple conversations, like, it's post-civil rights. Where's our Martin and Malcolm? I was like, all right, well, it was different times. I think it's more local, right? And not to be that guy, but it's just an issue with policing in our communities, right? So and it stems over to other things. I'm not condoning looting and all that, but you're seeing a symptom of something that always happens, right? But when we try to address the problem, we go to the looting, right? So if you even look on captions, they say mass protesters, but they show looting, right? So it's mindsets and things that we're doing, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, that's just going to perpetuate it. And we're living in the moment, right? So back in the civil, and again, I know this because I studied, but back in the civil rights era, like the freedom fighters and all that, they planned for 2 years after Emmett Till to make their move, right? Where we're just reacting. So I just think that, and it's not just the African American thing. I think as a community, if you look at the civil rights movement, there were a lot of other people that participated because it was just fair and just. But I think we lose all these messages, is what I'm saying, and it is very frustrating. But it gives me resolve because the work we do, the work I do, is really about creating opportunities to prevent that looting. But we have to take that systematic view, which is all we try to talk about. But it's just a symptom of something we got to fix. But we're not going to fix it over time, and we're not going to react to what we see right now. And that's just very frustrating. So I know I'm rambling on, but I'll just stop there.
I'll raise my paw. I have a couple of observations. One that's a catalyst for change, but I'll start with context. My grandmother taught in the Chicago school system for 50 years. She taught through the Depression for free. One of her scorecards for several decades, because she taught on the South Side and she taught high school history. And she was not of the same color as most of the people in the school she was to keep people out of jail was her metric of success. And having responded to the letters over a lifetime for her, I know that education and skilling is important. So my first observation would be, Kaufman and ESHIP, get off your ass. This is an opportunity, not a problem. Number two is a phrase that some of the people in Kaufman have used before is ecosystem architects. We're not about news. We're about creating ecosystems that work, survive, and adapt. I think our legacy as a group and an organization is going to be our ability to contribute in this space with methods that work to address situations like this in a positive way, because there's going to be a lot more pain from COVID and other things in the coming year, I hate to say. I also lived in Detroit, so I know where 10 Mile is. I know where Woodward is. I've had my car bumped and challenged in several cities, not because I was the problem driving through it, just because I was in the city. So I think we've got a golden opportunity here, and it's acceptance, awareness. There's a huge change going on, and we've got to facilitate it, not contain it per se. But part of it is we need to shine the light in the direction to look, not shine the light on the activity that's going on, to the point of it's not about the looting. That's not the message. The message is people want opportunities and they need stuff. So I think we need to help them focus on how that can be done and how we can help in a positive way. And I apologize for being slightly un-PC in that, but a view.
Christine, Norris, Beth, if you have anything you'd like to share.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. I was just going to type it in the chat. But Mark and Peter really resonate with what you both have shared. And Scott, I feel like this is a trusted space to be open. So I think there's, appreciate the acknowledgement of the PC language, but also it's good just to hear from the raw place that you're coming from. It's interesting. Yesterday, getting a lot of, phone calls and seeing things on the news because I'm in Los Angeles. And it's been interesting, at least the limited news that I saw, I felt they did a fairly good job of being able to differentiate and make sure people understood that the protests were different from the looting and the rioting. I agree that I think there's a a big opportunity for us, and also for us to pressure news and press and media to make sure that they're actually telling the story that needs to be told. And so, yeah, I hear you, Scott. I think one of the things that's been coming up on phone calls last week and this week is how do we, one, make sure that we're not silent at the very least, because that is just conceding. And two, ensuring that the individuals, influences, organizations that we have connections and access to are hearing from us to be able to make sure the messages are spread out in the way that they need to be heard. I think a lot of folks, at least from the NRP perspective, are trying to figure out how do we convey these messages in a way organizationally, even though we have very specific individual points of view. And so I think just being able to also encourage them to be as human as possible in all their communication. There's been a lot of good examples from other foundations and other organizations whose leaders have spoken from a very personal first person on behalf of the organization as much as they're able to. So yeah, I think in terms of just how I'm arriving today, similar to Cecilia, heavy and yet still hopeful, knowing that sometimes things have to get worse before they get better, and trusting that, you know, hopefully we can learn these lessons and it may not just be this exact moment in time, but it'll be over a period of time. So appreciate what everyone's been sharing thus far.
I'll share a little bit, I guess. I'm too feeling pretty heavy and appreciate and agree with most of everything that's been said so far. I'm also apprehensive. I think I'm getting used to being shocked and not knowing what foot to put in front of the other. So together we'll get through this just like we are the COVID, and hopefully nothing else tragic is gonna pop in front of us anytime soon.
Thanks, Beth. Norris, do you want to share something?
Answer for projects.
Well, I'm sorry, I having some tech issues here. Like Peter, I remember, I remember 68, and it's something that's not quite as, there's a lot of, certainly a lot of media coverage in the US, but in Europe, it devastated the European economy. I mean, they had it caused a recession that we didn't have here, and that is sometimes looking globally is helpful, but I kind of the downside of this is that, oh God, what's next is sort of on my mind, is that bad things come in threes. I know that's a myth, but what is the very next thing that's going to hit us? But I'm gonna, if I can, Scott, when you were in Detroit, were you a Red Wings fan?
No, but you have to be aware of the Red Wings.
Yes,
There's a difference between being a fan and being aware.
Well, I wanted that sort of the hockey analogy of attributed to Wayne Gretzky is you skate to where the puck's going to be rather than where it is now. And I think we have in our ESHIP family, we have a lot of people who understand that, you know, we're looking at moving targets. That's a lot more complicated than a puck or a soccer ball going down the track. But, you know, to skate, how do we get out, you know, in front and say, how can we be, become acting, not reacting? How do we, where is, can we get some sense of where we ought to be going and work on that? I think we have that opportunity to, in building ecosystems, how transformative that could be. Like, I was joking with someone about, someone was asking me, so Boise is like Mogadishu with its ecosystem. And I'm like, we're not that bad. And he laughs, says, you haven't looked at Mogadishu recently in Somalia. It's actually becoming a very promising economy, like Medellin in Colombia. That how do we, my thinking is, how do we got out in front of us is that I live in Boise, which, you know, already have idea of protesting is sending off emails to our congressman. It's but that day, that could change overnight. So how do we as ESHIP get out there and help build diverse, inclusive ecosystems that provide, raise the human capital, raise the social capital of everyone? And that's something I think we know how to do. So how can we get to it, regardless of what crap may be landing on us next? Probably a meteor. But I'm really glad to have you guys, on my radar screen. It's definitely comforting. And as always, I over-answered the question. Sorry.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad that I think it helps us align in knowing that the work that we do is needed now, and now there's more of a sense of urgency, because if we don't do it, then who's going to do it, right? So the idea of Team Now and Team Next is actually coming to fruition. We've really approached a lot of that. So thank you all for sharing generously and your concerns and being vulnerable, and there's a call to action I'm hearing, and I appreciate that. So we'll definitely be sharing all of those thoughts. So in looking at the agenda topic and knowing that in order to move forward, we definitely need initiatives and efforts around funding to support these projects to get to sustainable work. So, so there are several people on this call that are very uniquely situated. Peter with his work around the day after and workforce, and Norris and Christine having recently led that webinar about the ESHIP initiatives with the, I'm going to get these acronyms in the wrong place, ICSB, ISCB. It's okay. Anyway, and then Mark has been talking around funding circles and funding compasses, which I know Beth, a while back, Beth and Katie had been talking about how to get a funders circle around foundations, community foundations, and how to move that work forward. So ICSB, yes, there's so many acronyms. So I want to open it up to, and if somebody can help scribe, we can make a note of initiatives and efforts, and maybe talk about how to go forward from here. Like, so my questions for all of you are, where do you see the need? Where do you see the opportunities? And then what can we do to move forward? So those are three questions, and I'll put that into the notes. So I think it's somewhat of a framework to go forward. So where do we see the need? Where do we see the opportunities, and what are the action steps that we can do? And we'll try to populate it in the right buckets. So I will turn it over to Norris and Beth and Mark, who lead this call.
Well, I start. One is that if you haven't watched the video of that call, I've been getting pretty regular. Every couple days, I hear from someone who watched the webinar, and they were very, there are people who are very intrigued. And the nice thing about, this is ICSB is an organization that's very good at taking action. That, I joked with the executive director, well, here's an idea that only need a couple $1 million. And he said, well, if it's worth a couple million, we'll help you find it. And it was like, that's always nice to hear. I think we have not found people who, in the past, who have have had that sort of attitude. And the executive director every couple days has asked me, do I have the wish list of ideas that they like to share with their leadership and their members for projects, whether it's resources or talent, is it data, is it money, is it whatever. I don't think we should be shy about that. I emailed the goal champions and said, what do you got that we could pitch to them? And they're willing to take a lengthy list. If they have there are 5 items on a list, or there's 10, that means maybe their attitude is that's twice as many possibilities that somebody will say, oh, I know who could fund that, or I know people who could help move that forward. So to the other, I'm looking forward to building that list. But I would say that the feedback is that the executive director is madly in love with Christine and Beth, and Annika. So that's a good sign. He's one of these very enthusiastic people who he kind of either loves you or doesn't care, and you really want to be on the loves you side of the equation. But I think we represented pretty well, and that I think at a deeper level that suggests that there may be other groups out there, there may be other opportunities. Definitely want to seize that opportunity. And speaking of that, one of the simpler things was you guys all know Joey Aurora, right? That the AppWorks in their latest solicitation, they were looking for consulting ideas for building local cultures of innovation among their constituents. And I sent it up to Mark, and in like 2 days later, he had made a submission. So, if that hits, that's something in his backyard where he can actually, start building the ecosystem very proactively. We probably should be looking out at things like SBIR and some of these other. EDA has some new initiatives. I think we'll get. So I'm going to pass. I will pass it on to Mark. I was just really tickled that it took him like 48 hours to write a brilliant proposal. So good on you.
Yeah, thanks for that. But again, it was just the go do it in me, and I had a team that we were already working on, so the opportunity met the description. But I think the need, back to that point, just sort of picking up, right? It was buried deep in a lot of technical SBR language, right? There was a whole bunch of where you wouldn't traditionally look, right? So there was a lot of opportunities there, but it said culture, innovation, how do you build based in the future? So what I would say is we need to because folks don't speak our ecosystem language. So we need to go and translate to find those opportunities to fund us. Because, I've talked to Dell about this a lot, Dell Gines, Ronnie. So, there's funding the system level. There's rarely a procurement or an opportunity or a grant that's going to fund the system, but it'll fund pieces of it. But through relationship building, talking to folks, you sort of got to educate them before you submit. Which takes a lot of effort, but we're all doing it sort of in isolation, and I'm a victim of that. But if we could build some sort of, and I say it, the only way I know it is where I come from, some sort of consulting practice that goes out and tries to take out of these, projects like Beth does something, Scott does something, Peter, Norris. We go after an opportunity, we got a piece that'll help us create some funds and revenue to do all the stuff that we're already doing for free. But I'll go back to the need is really translation. It's relationship building, which takes a lot of time. Through the work we do with Startup Champions, like EDA, the Economic Development Administration should fund what we do, but we still can't speak in their terms because we know folks, right? We know Craig, we know all the folks there throughout the ESHIP community. But I had an interesting call with my local EDA person the other day because I've submitted tons of concepts to the build to scale and all that, and I got discouraged on like 2 of them. It's like one, maybe I submitted too many, but frankly, she said, in not so many words, they typically fund education institutions because they know they're not going anywhere, or very large nonprofits, right? So that's a mindset. So if you didn't come, even though I had those folks on my team, I submitted as the lead and it got flagged, right? So again, it's the translation. Understanding how they buy what we want to deliver is something else we got to do. the opportunities are out there, but I think Meg, Lam, we need the folks that are good at research to look at, to discover those, and then we vet those. So I'll be quiet after that because I know I just said a lot.
Well, that's one thing that I realized. I was talking to someone here locally. It's like, why didn't you, here's a program that's right up your alley, and they're like, it was what you said is that they did actually look at it, but they couldn't figure out what the hell they meant. And there's some of them. There's an SBA, I'm sorry, the SBIR for USDA that has basically they've got a topic that's we would look at and go, oh, that's rural ecosystem building, and they don't fund very many of that topic, but they have no idea who we are. But who would have seen that? But what shocked me is that, that you're saying the translation on both directions is really important. And certainly I'm making a point every time I see something like that might matter, I'm going to pass it along. And, to Mark and Beth and the whole family because some of these amazingly go unfunded, they don't spend the money because they can't find anybody. So that should definitely be a call to action, but we all should have our radar tuned to these possibilities. I was shocked how much is out there for rural development. It's like, again, foundations, they can't spend all their money because they don't have enough good projects. And of course, we have to figure out what good means to them, but
let me jump in here on a couple of thoughts. First of all, in EDA, in terms of EDA, I think one of the major tripwires with EDA is their 50-50 requirement. And so where universities and large not-for-profits have an advantage is that they can do a lot of indirect match or soft match to that money, because EDA will accept soft match. So if you're carrying a large overhead, you're carrying other sorts of things, you can apply that towards the match, and that's one way where they can get through in terms of getting EDA's money. We've had one project with EDA, and it was actually a good experience. One of the things I did learn with EDA that I hadn't learned with some of the other federal departments is that their program officers will work with you in shaping the proposal to help you get into their system. So they have they do coach people, who are writing the proposals, and then there's a separate decision making that goes on within the regional office as to whether you get funded or not. But the major point I wanted to make was that I've been having a lot of conversations with Don Mackey, with some folks at the National Governors Association. In fact, I put the two of them together at a meeting on Friday. And one of the things that I'm hearing also in terms of locally is that we're not going to have a shortage of people who are going to try to be entrepreneurs. And the reason for that is because they're not finding jobs to go back to, or they won't find jobs to go back to. And so, Don calls it essential entrepreneurship. I've heard terms like subsistence entrepreneurship. I've heard of all sorts of other things. Getting people interested in starting up their businesses and again, it'll be a matter of making do or survival. Isn't going to be hard. What's going to be hard is the migration from that initial jump into it to actually succeeding and this being a real entrepreneurial opportunity for them over the longer term. So we've been looking at use of WIOA money, Workforce Innovation Opportunity grant money, and working with the local workforce boards. And we have 5 cities in the Midwest of metro workforce boards that are very much interested in applying some of their resources to supporting entrepreneurs in terms of case management and training, because that's what they can do. Matching that up then with sources of capital is the next thing, and that's where I think foundations can play a big role. is in providing some of those micro grants that are helpful in getting both the enterprise up and running, but also in terms of providing some sort of patient capital to help them move forward in terms of growing the business. There are no regs behind this in terms of employment and training administration. There have been a couple of pilots in this, but I suspect that they were able to just simply get waivers in terms of reporting requirements. So, you know, our effort, and we're trying to figure out a way to fund it, in getting these 5 metro boards on board is, well, they're on board, is then how do we meet the requirements with WIOA in terms of placements, you know, long-term employment, all you know, things like that work in the context of what an entrepreneur does. So I think those kinds of systems, there's going to be demand for help in terms of setting up new enterprises by entrepreneurs. How you shape the response to support that is I think going to be is really the next challenge. And I think these, and at least, you know, 5 workforce boards in the Midwest are interested in doing that.
Peter, is Columbus one of them?
Yes.
I grew up near there, and they're just, they've got some just amazing stuff. But, you know,
So I'll give you the 5 real quick. It's Milwaukee, Kansas City, Columbus, Detroit, and Pittsburgh.
Nice. Well, one of the things that, and this came up, I was talking to Victor about, you know, there's a lot of talk about that if you're going to do policy to grow entrepreneurship, you should be growing, we should put 110% of our money into the high-tech, high-growth startups that we're not, you know, they're not interested in necessity entrepreneurs. The biggest bang for our policy buck is to focus on, you know, potential unicorns, which sounds insane to me, you know, as a social scientist, but there's a lot of reason to be worried, but it's also a huge opportunity if we can make the case. And one of the data points I gave, that I gave Victor was that there are these large surveys and say, okay, are you a necessity entrepreneur, an opportunity entrepreneur? Are you doing it because you have to, or because you? And what's interesting, a lot of people who start out as necessity entrepreneurs, and these are often from, you know, they're displaced homemakers, they're in the inner city, they're in the rural areas, they're returning veterans. And interesting, after a year or two, they suddenly say, no, I'm not a necessity entrepreneur, I'm an opportunity entrepreneur. They figured it out and are off and rolling. The Kaufman Firm survey found some of this. So I think there's a case to be made. I haven't figured out how to, you know, something maybe we can collaboratively articulate why what we're doing really, really does matter. That yes, we're not trying to build the next, you know, Microsoft, but, you know, it's, you know, in Portland, they call it the zebras. You know, do you have a very successful herd of well-established businesses, or do you try to shoot for the moon on every you know, with all your powder? You aim for the unicorns. And I kind of like, zebras are not, in real life, are not actually very nice creatures, but I think it's a great metaphor that, you know, we're zebra builders, we're not unicorn builders. But if we can make the case, and you can tell from my response here that, you know, I'm still struggling with it, but I think there's a case to be made. And I think it does tie back to COVID. It does tie back to the current social unrest that, you know, I think maybe more than ever, I mean, it's nice to say more than ever, they need us. The question is, how do we make them want us? And I think you guys are all on the same wavelength. Anyway, I'll shut up.
I can jump in a little bit because I know Beth and I are sidebarring a little bit in the chat. I think another thing that's been coming up in terms of sustainable work in particular, but also what each of you are touching upon in your comments thus far, is actually being more specific and clear as to what ecosystem building activities mean and what ecosystem builders do at a systems level. I think over the past few years, both due to things emerging, but also the nature of the work. We've kind of like lumped everything together in terms of entrepreneurship. I think like at the beginning of ESHIP, at least from my observation and through the conversations I've had, there wasn't an interest in differentiating high tech, high growth from Main Street because we want come one, come all to everybody that was attracted to entrepreneurship. And so now there is a need, as each of you are bringing up, to be more specific around high tech, high growth, Main Street lifestyle, the way that you're talking about it, Norris, with your conversation with Victor, necessity or opportunity entrepreneurship. I think that's a really nice, clear way of differentiating it. And so from the way of who's going to fund these things and where these opportunities are coming from, the way that Cecilia outlined these questions is really nice, is getting really clear as to who are the organizations understanding this work from systems level versus just from an entrepreneur support organization lens. Because I think right now they're all kind of bucketed together, at least in the NRP way that the community has organized. And so there's an important need to differentiate the systems level work. And yeah, I have a call with Don soon too, just to kind of check in with him on some of the things around that. But I think the more that practitioners and organizations can get clear on what these activities are and just be specific with the stories that we're telling, to make sure that we're uplifting the stories that are talking from a systems level versus a local level, or from a entrepreneur support level versus a cross-sector multi-organization level, the better we'll be at actually being able to then tell the wider story to the EDA, to other big organizations who hold larger amounts of money to be able to fund what this role actually looks like.
I think that kind of lends to the sense making that a lot of the work that we're doing right now is helping to maybe synthesize more of the information that's out there. And then we've talked about translation as a needed thing, and I think one of the points that we touched on was the fact that there's system-wide thing and there's local things, right? So what local things need are sometimes the opportunities to be able to see what's out in the rest of the world, so that they're not, it's like civilizations that grow in isolation, and you're better informed when you know that there's other ways of looking, and people only know what they know and they don't know what they don't know. And so given the opportunity, and that's something that we're all uniquely qualified for, is because right now we have this opportunity to be on a national platform, to be able to stand up and say, hey, so there's this thing, and there's a community over here that's really doing it well, so that other communities that are doing similar work or trying to tackle similar problems can look at it and say, oh, okay, I don't have to reinvent that. Like, not every individual community has to reinvent their own version of the wheel, that we can actually learn from each other. And that's the information that's out there. So I love that it's really a lot of sense making, and as much as we make better sense of what's out there, the murkiness, we'll be able to find clear actions. So this has been a really interesting and helpful exercise. So thank you. What's missing? What are we not talking? What are you looking at the list that's on the agenda? What is it that you talk about, think about, that you're not seeing represented on that list?
A quick question too before we transition to that, Cecilia, just because I know Beth shared the latest draft of the entrepreneur ecosystem builder role. I'm curious if there's an opportunity or need from what folks are sharing to translate, if we can almost create like a matrix of like what people already are funding as roles that exist now, and what those roles and responsibilities are, and how that differentiates from the ecosystem builder role, if that makes sense, to show the gap, like literally the gap that exists, which is what ecosystem builders are filling, that currently people don't know how to value. And like Mark's talking about, like relationships and time are kind of like sometimes intangible things, and then looking to another group around like goals and metrics around, or metrics and ways to measure that. I'm just curious to build upon what's currently the team's already been working on, or the group's already been working on.
So it seems like that's a really good thing to put under the what we can do to catalyze, because that's basically what you're talking about, right? How do we know what's missing if we don't define what's out there? And that's a good project to work on. And depending on who has the energy and the bandwidth to work on something like that.
Yep. And then I'd share it, then transitioning to your actual question and what's missing here, what are the opportunities. I have a conversation later this week with the Council on Foundations. I think one of the things that I've been curious about, that I've had a conversation with a few of you on this call, is the connection between like the small group of national funders and then local community foundations, and how do we activate the local dollars, or how do we actually identify new donor groups, and then give those foundations both capacity building grants and actual grants to fund activity and roles like this in their local areas. And so I had a call this morning with Living Cities on a similar thread as well. So yeah, welcome more things that folks are hearing or seeing or sensing that can help inform some of this work moving forward from an organizational perspective.
So Christine, let me ask a question, because I don't know the answer to this, and so it's not a leading question, but what foundations have done typically when they try to organize some sort of systemic approach to a set of issues is they'll pull together, you know, a funders alliance for X, Y, and Z. And what I've been just to your point, Celia, sort of as you scan this foundation world, it's sort of like trying to create a sense of order in something that is distinctly disorganized. And everybody's sort of doing their own theory of change. Everybody's sort of following their own philosophy.
Yes.
I mean, even within Kaufman, there's sort of two different threads, one around opportunity, you know, entrepreneurship, and another around, you know, essential entrepreneurship or whatever, or necessity entrepreneurship. And, you know, depending on who you talk to in the foundation, you got two different answers, even within Kaufman. And so, so the question, you know, so are you aware that there's been any effort on the part of these foundations to organize some sort of funders alliance or anything of that nature? That would help to start bringing some order to this, so that we can then figure out what the gap analysis is, and then also what's the relationship between the national funders and the community funders.
Yeah, Beth, I saw you went off mute. Do you want to chime in first?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Southeast Michigan has done, what's it called, NEA, I think it is, where they brought a lot of the foundations together to fund the identification and improvement of their entrepreneurial ecosystem. That's a great story. In Danville, Virginia is another one with the Launch Place, where their foundation stepped up, and they've got probably upwards of $15 to $20 million invested in the last 7 to 10 years, I think. So those stories are out there.
But nothing nationally that you're aware of?
So from a national perspective, I mean, Beth and I have been kind of going down this path of inquiry. So there's the Entrepreneur Funders Network, EFN. It's been, yeah, a fairly nascent, slow moving, but continuing progress in terms of the small handful of national funders. I have limited kind of insight into it, as they're kind of also figuring their own things out, but I try to touch base every now and then from the point person who goes to represent Kaufman in that conversation. And so I think that's one of the groups that I know of from a national perspective. And I think to your point around, like, you know, everyone have their own theory of change and all of that, I think the opportunity that we have now is kind of like, well, what is the thing that aligns all of us? At the end of the day, are we trying to create more resilient economies locally? Like, what is the thing that is the most neutral, but the thing that aligns all of us? And then might there be an opportunity then bottom up, top down to meet somewhere? So that's the conversation with the Council on Foundations, because they have like 800 plus community foundations that are part of their community. And so being able to identify and kind of, like Beth's saying, share those stories of like what's working, to show that there are different ways of organizing and informing each other about what's actually needed. It doesn't have to be just this top-down approach. And so, yeah, I think all of those things are all conversations that are, you know, continuing to happen right now.
And I know that that Victor, while he was at the foundation, had put together a convening or started to get together a group of foundations that were wholly focused on entrepreneurship to put together some kind of funding alliance. I don't know where that's gone.
I don't know if that's
since he's gone.
just similar or different than EFN. I'm curious. I can ask.
Yeah,
about that.
well, because EFN was already an established thing, but there was a thing that Victor was working on where he was trying to identify organizations that were, I have to reach out to Victor and see where he was at on it and whatever happened, or Andy might know. So we may touch on that on our team call. Mark, will you share, we can cut and paste some of this into the
Yes, Mark.
agenda, but share what you were saying, please.
Saying with regards to, I'm sorry.
Oh, in the chat.
Yeah, Mark, I think what you're pointing to is exactly kind of my inquiry around what the next level could be of this job description. Because like you're saying, like the VP of Innovation and Entrepreneurship Development exists. People understand to some extent what that looks like. And so I'm curious if we were to build upon what Beth shared in this job description of the draft entrepreneurial ecosystem builder, is there a way we can matrix out the actual roles and qualifications of this individual, and then how that maps or doesn't map to the entrepreneurial ecosystem builder to show the gaps that exist, or the way that they also could be two in the same role. So just being able to, like we talked about, translate, being able to talk the same language of what's already funded out there that exists and how that came to be. And then this next evolution of what the entrepreneurial ecosystem builder role is.
Right, and this is the
Yeah.
bridge. Okay, now I see, because I just pulled up with Beth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the conversation really is, and again, this is just what the conversations I have, but I have it on a national. Is ecosystem building a role or a business model, right? Because you have all these other people you have to pull together. So going in and say, okay, I'm an ecosystem builder, you're going to offend the economic development person, the VP of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, research, anybody who works with entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah.
So how do you go in and have the conversation that you're additive, right? And I usually say this myself, I'm just trying to connect the dots and dive in where there's gaps.
Yes.
Right? But there's no role position for that. We bring you in if there's a problem, a crisis, or an issue. So, and again, it's the struggle of being something new. Because if you talk to some people, right? Like I talked to some of these people at the Department of Commerce Minority Business Development Agency, and they say, "Oh, this ecosystem building thing is not new. We've been doing this for years. You're just calling it something fancy, right?" So that's a gate closer right there, or a challenge to resources. Or you talk to other people, ecosystem. Since I started getting involved with Kaufman, is like the most overused term with innovation right now. So you have those two diapoles that you're trying to have a communication with in the community to try to solve a problem. And that's why I said it's a translation. So I don't know if we're going to come in and say, hey, we're the cool kids, all the stuff you've been doing sucks, so you hire us. Or let me show you how we can add value and have a role, right? And how can we do that? So let's respect what's been done for the folks that we got to placate, right? Because to some people, inclusive innovation, ecosystem, that's been around forever. So now you guys are taking a hold of it and trying to run with it. So totally. It's a cultural thing, really, that I think we have to work on. And we've talked about that a lot. But on the hand-to-hand, trying to actually sell and do work around it is very hard, because you spend time in lexicon and dealing with biases. Because everyone thinks they're doing innovation, everyone thinks they're doing ecosystem building, everyone thinks they're looking broadly, and a lot of this is barred in politics within our local communities, and the funds are always local. It's hard to get funds, because here's another thing too, because I just dealt with it this morning. So the whole idea of ecosystem building, economic development, and placemaking, right, gets confused. And I spent an hour on a call just to try to get everybody to agree what we were talking about, which got frustrating.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about, Mark, is like a very delicate and very nuanced conversation. And I actually trust a lot of folks that are on these meetup calls and in the ESHIP community to actually have and I talked to Cecilia about this, kind of like the healthy dose of ego in this work, because they're actually, I think, needs to be the individual who's actually able to have the trusted relationships with everyone else who holds very complementary roles, to then show how there is still a need for additional role. is what I'm hearing. And I think the case is different in each local community, because there may be a trifecta of individuals who essentially together are the ecosystem building team.
Right.
But I think being able to then have that, I don't think it's ready to be kind of like spread out across the country yet, because it's so unique per community. And so I guess what I'm curious about for this group in particular and for our ESHIP community is, because we're probably the most uniquely positioned to see the differences and to have the relationships with people who can hear us and not be like totally defensive as to like where the value is and who offers that value, is being able to parse all those things out. So the more detailed, the more specific, the more clear we can be with the roles and the description and the activities, I think the more that we'll be able to all see the need for the ecosystem builder that complements the VP of innovation, the economic developer, the person who's focused on placemaking, all of those things. And so I think if the ecosystem builder can come from a place of curiosity and listen, and then kind of connect all the dots and like show that, then we can have a much different conversation from a different place. And then we can identify the funder who may complement what's already existing in the funding landscape, you know. But we have to almost meet people with a little more information and extend a little bit more, because we already know the work that they've been doing for the past several decades or their whole careers. And
Right.
so, you know, meeting them where they're at in a place where they can receive that information is really important.
Yeah, it's
So-
Chris. Go ahead.
I was going to be mindful of time, but Norris, do you want to share something before?
Yeah,
I
what struck me is something that it's a hidden problem in innovation in large organizations. You've got people, they really are the cool kids. They're doing all these, they're the ones turning around the company. That if we really do have the answers, that's actually more dangerous than being innocuous. That that we are a disruptive threat in many ways, and that's a very different argument. But one thing I was triggered by Christine saying that we're healthy ego. I know that all of you guys are shy and retiring, as I am. That's a problem in corporate innovation. Is even if you are the badass cool kid, don't act like it. that this notion of, even if you're there to take their job and their money, don't act like it. Because we don't really know in a complex adaptive system. Thank you, Alistair and Rick Smyer, that we don't know what's going to happen. But figuring out, what is our value add? What is the value proposition that we bring to everyone? We do know that from research in economic development that healthy communities, what job an organization plays in the ecosystem tends to be where do you add the most value? Not what your mission statement says, not what you want to do, but where do you add the most value? And that kind of naturally evolves in healthy communities. But that's something we can nudge along. But reaching out. The other thing that is, in fact, there's someone doing a doctoral dissertation on this now. You may have an entity that is hell-bent to not let the ecosystem builders have any money, any say. But even in those organizations, you may have a double agent, that there are people in that organization, even in the heart of the good old boy network, who knows these are the right cards to play and will help you. But it comes down to figuring out what, for every stakeholder you have, what's your value proposition? What is it? We really need to do a stakeholder analysis. And this is something we could teach all of the members of ESHIP Nation how to do, is how to identify all the possible stakeholders and how to figure out how we can be of immense value to them. And we might be very pleasantly surprised at, call it customer discovery, call it stakeholder mapping. I think there's something we could do that would help, not just help the cause, but more importantly to help the people like Mark and Beth on the ground.
Yeah, thanks Norris for sharing. I also saw Scott kind of
wanted to say something, and what Beth I think was defining was a lot of what Norris has said, and this is a conversation that's a constant with ecosystem builders. Go ahead, Scott.
To context before I share a couple of suggestions. One is I haven't been in group 7 as much as I've been in group 6, so I don't have the legacy, so I apologize. So if I'm crossing over or saying something that does not align, just be aware I'm ignorant. Number 2, I've had the opportunity, blessing or curse, of trying lots of these things. I did work in Medellin, the West Bank, Saudi, parts of the US on ecosystems for the last 20 years. There are 2 or 3 models I would like to suggest that are different than some of the points we've addressed here. And the first tenet is if we don't read history, we will repeat it. The second one is there's a group in the Silicon Valley that was a spin out of Stanford, which was called SRI, or Stanford Research Institute before that, that set up collaborative economics as a pilot project about 25 years ago. Their work was on something called incubation. And at the time it was equally as innovative, novel, but same stuff as we're doing and same stuff as people did before them. But they learned 2 things in their process besides what they delivered. One is make it easy to buy so that people don't view you as a threat that you're delivering. And the number 1 component of that is don't sell jobs, sell a project. Therefore, there is no sustaining position. What you're doing is solving a problem, and there's a sunset clause to get out. Therefore, you are not an institutional threat. And I apologize, that's the single biggest observation I'd make on the position description I saw circulated, is it inherently causes a red flag from every institution that already exists. Therefore, instead of offering an institutional solution, offer a sunset clause initiative that evaporates based on performance, then it is never a permanent feature. The second one is hospitals are something that's geographic, just like the communities that we serve. You can't move a hospital in Chicago or in Kansas City or in Detroit. They just are there. You can add another extension to it and put it someplace else in the world, but it is a physical location just like our communities or ecosystems. A group called the Advisory Board found that they could help hospitals by doing 2 things. One is they got data that nobody else could get, and they provided it to the hospitals and they sold it to them. And 2 is they did consulting. They got privatized, they went public, they got privatized, they got split up, they're no longer existing, but they proved a model over 2 decades that says, if you want to disrupt historical institutions, don't fix them, do what they can't do. Which was, in this case, find the best practices, share them with them, and make them pay for it, and then go away. And then when they want more as to how to do the best practices, have them pay for how you put it in versus just read about it. And they became very, very lucrative and successful. Kaufman could be the next advisory board, for lack of a better word, or the next collaborative economics from the lessons learned from those, without creating permanent institutional pain to the EDA or anybody else by saying, I have a job that displaces somebody, that you need to make a financial decision between paying Norris or Mark or Peter. We're not going to do that. What we do is, you've got this problem, here's the metric we're going to help you address. When it's done, we're out. So sorry for the long background.
No, I think that's a good thing to think about. So I really love to continue thinking about things like that in how we move forward and what it is that the strategy is, right? So just like with the organization, the protests and all those things that are going on right now, the call to action has been to organize, to plan, and to strategize. That's what we need to do on a community level. That's what we need to do in this work in our sector and this nation, on how do we do that better. And since, so another thing, if there's something like that written out somewhere, Scott, where you've done that, would you share that either with in the Slack channel or on the agenda, so that people can reference that? Because I think that's a really important thing to think about. It's a different approach.
But this is kind of like saying, can you tell me how to figure out women?
Oh.
I could write it down, but it's not an appropriate thing to be written down or say it is the gospel.
How about this? Okay.
That's why there is a history, and I'll take just the advisory board for a moment. They went through 3 or 4 different unique phases. 2 of those phases are relevant to what Kaufman and ESHIP is going through. 2 of them are not. They were purely financial plays. That were financial engineering, hence why they merged with an innovation company. That wasn't trying to solve the issue of their customers.
Right.
That was, they wanted to get out. So the only reason I'm bringing this up is, depending on what we want as a group, this is where you need to almost deconstruct and rebuild it relative to what we're trying to do. It's not a case study for what it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I hear you. I think it's some of the stuff I've been sharing with our internal team as well, is figuring out what that looks like. So 2 things I want you to think about besides the wonderful stuff that Scott just shared. There will be some kind of call, and maybe this is the appropriate time to think about this, Scott. There will be some kind of call for presentations that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks for the ESHIP Summit, and something like that, a framework or something. So you may not be able to tell us how to figure ourselves out, but maybe it's a good discussion or a presentation point to share. So I want to invite you to do that. Also keeping in mind that the ESHIP Summit is going virtually. So if you have not received your notice, September 15th and 16th, we will be a 100% virtual summit. And because it's a 100% virtual summit, there is opportunity that you won't get otherwise, right? To reach a wider audience, to share out. So think about what you want people to know about what ecosystem building is. Right? Because we have a bigger platform and a bigger stage to be able to share that out. So anyway, I'm going to give you back the rest of your day. Thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate you. Anyone who's going to be on the Goal 5 call, that'll take place in less than an hour, and we will see you later.
Thanks for the great input, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye.